What we really need to do is get the government out of education. And people think, oh, that's terrible, because if it wasn't for the government providing education, nobody would be educated. That's not true.
Notice how he's shifting the goalposts in a subtle way here. Nobody would claim that if government funding for education were canceled, that nobody would have access to education, that there wouldn't be any education at all, right? The question is, how do the poor have access to education? How do the poorest of the poor have access to education? How do you provide universal education? And when I say universal, I do not just mean that it is accessible to the rich and poor alike. I mean that it is the same for each and every one. That Muslims and Christians and Jews are all forced to learn the theory of evolution. Something they may not want to pay for if they're in a clientelistic relationship where they're paying for individual tutors the way people did in the Dark Ages. Not everyone wants to learn, algebra. There are a lot of things people are not going to pay to learn if the government's role in education becomes zero. They may not even learn to brush their teeth and wash their hands and use condoms, where babies come from, how AIDS is spread, what to do with an unwanted pregnancy. There's a whole lot of information that's going to disappear from education when you eliminate the universality of education. Universal education isn't just about providing education to the poor. It's about providing the same education to the rich and poor alike. It's about providing the same education to sophisticated, secular, urban people, and perhaps not so sophisticated, rural, deeply religious people. It's about providing the same education to immigrants who may have just arrived in your country from Saudi Arabia and Iran as people who've lived in your country for 400 years.
The government did two things. They made a college degree very expensive, and then they made it practically worthless. Because before the government started subsidizing college, fewer people actually went, because only the people that could really benefit from the degree went. And so then if you had a college degree, it actually meant something in the marketplace. Now, since everybody goes to school, because it's, you get the money from the government, everybody's got a college degree, they mean nothing.
Both on the left and on the right, we often have to deal with this pattern of people believing in an abstract principle and then being drawn in step by step to refuse to consider, to reject the evidence before them, the evidence of real experience in the real world, because they'd prefer to believe in the abstract principle. And this makes the political sphere, step by step, more and more like a religion. So to critique the left for just half a second before I critique the right wing on this particular issue, I've spoken to so many left-wingers who just wanted to assert to me the abstract principle that making heroin and cocaine completely legal and decriminalized would solve the drug addiction problem, and that this had already happened in Switzerland and Portugal. Switzerland and Portugal. I've had this conversation several times with left-wingers. Now, I don't respond by telling them that the abstract principle they believe in is wrong. Like, I don't respond by telling them Santa Claus ain't got no beard. I respond by trying to direct their attention to empirical reality, to real facts, to real history. I very often respond with questions like, okay, have you looked at what the drug laws in Switzerland actually are? Have you looked at what the laws and procedures in Portugal really are? And have you looked at the outcomes? Have you looked at the results? Like, there are two different types of misconceptions here. Like, one misconception would be that the situation with drug addiction in Portugal is really so much better than the situation in France. These are comparable countries. They're both in Western Europe. They both have a large-scale drug addiction problem, right? But then there's also the misconception, okay, what do you think actually happens when drug addicts are arrested and taken into court in Portugal? And of course, very often, they didn't even know that happened. They believed in a myth. They believed in not just a story, a made-up story that serves to vindicate this abstract principle. The same way religious people make up a story so they can believe in Jesus or Moses or any of the mythological heroes of Hinduism or Buddhism, right? The problem isn't with the detail of the story. The problem isn't with whether or not Santa Claus has a beard. The problem is the psychological effect of this story in your mind, that it digs you into this false sense of certainty of the abstract principle. And the certainty in the abstract principle, they won't let go of it. So my experience is when talking to left-wingers about drug policy, they very quickly just become flustered and leave the room or start shouting at me or shutting down, no matter how helpful I am in just trying to say, okay, well, let's talk about what are the laws in Switzerland. Let's talk about that step by let's actually discuss they cannot hear it. They cannot participate in the conversation. I'm threatening their faith. Every single time I've spoken to libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, or MISC right-wingers about these delusions that you could improve American education by eliminating all government funding. In the same way, they very, very quickly become flustered and leave the room. They can't talk about these things. They can make a completely general statement of principle, such as, in the past, government wasn't involved in funding or regulating education at all, and that was just fine. So in the future, we could go back to having that kind of... Oh, so are you talking about the 1840s? Do you want to talk about how education functioned in the 1840s and why it changed between the 1840s and the 1860s and the 1890s? Can we actually talk about this? And the reply is no, 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 no. As soon as you take a step into empirical reality, into real world details, they can't cope with it. They have to shut the conversation down. They have to run away. Because what they believe in, it's neither a solution for the problems of this world, nor is it even an analysis of the problems of this world. It's an abstract principle that's as far removed from the real world as the belief in God and hell and heaven.
You know, if it's just like saying if the government needs to provide food. No, we get great food from the farmers. You know, what about our cell phones? Does the government? No, it's the free market.
Are you talking about getting government funding or government administration?
No, I don't think the government should be involved in it. I think
at all.
No. I think
so. What about poor people who don't have an internet connection or books?
Poor people eat. Poor people have housing. Poor people have clothing. They get plenty of things from the free market. Whatever you value, the free market is going to provide it for you in a better quality at a lower cost. And if we got the government out of public education, people would pay to send their kids to school, but it wouldn't cost nearly as much, and taxes would be a lot lower, because you wouldn't have to pay taxes to support the public schools. You can buy tuition at a private school. That would be a fraction of the cost.
So he has revealed here the abstract principle that he believes in. And his belief is unshakable. It is not going to falter. It is not going to adapt. It is not going to change in response to empirically real evidence about how the real world works. And he didn't arrive at these conclusions through the comparative analysis of evidence that exists here in the real world, of which we have a whole lot if you're talking about the history of education, what education policies work and what don't. This abstract principle he believes in, that the free market will always deliver the service to you, the customer, at a lower price and a higher quality. What's cheaper? Sending a letter by U.S. Postal Service, by mail, or sending it by Federal Express, by UPS, by DHL, by private courier. You really can't think of a single example of a service that's provided by the government more cheaply and more efficiently than a private sector alternative. Really? Really? Let's stay within the realm of education. You can't think of any example anywhere in the world where the government is providing high school education at a lower price than private schools, than private for-profit schools, not schools run by a religious charity at a loss. That exists. That can be cheaper than the government. When the Catholics go to Cambodia and provide free education to Cambodian orphans if only they'll convert to Catholicism. When the Muslims want to convert people to Islam, they run education on a religious, non-profit basis. That's another story. That wasn't the comparison you were making. You weren't making a comparison to charity. You were making a comparison between government-provided services and the free market. And you know, it seems to me, even if we just limited ourselves to the history of the last 100 years, if we didn't go back any further, it seems to me there were a whole lot of countries where just due to war, poverty, chaos, the collapse of government from one period to the next, there have been periods of time where there was no positive role for government in education. Cambodia, for example, far off. Do we look back on that period when there was really no government involvement in education in Cambodia as a golden age for education? No. Any government anywhere in the world, Asia, Europe, Africa, just within the last 100 years, not even going back to the way education was transformed between the 1840s, 1860s, 1890s. No. This line of reasoning he's engaged in, all right, it is just as pious as the most pious Christian. It's telling you to close your eyes against the things of this world, because what he believes in are not things that can be seen, but things that remain unseen. They are magical axioms, always just outside your field of vision. If only you'd close your eyes and believe, you can disregard the mountains of evidence that what he's saying is just plain wrong.
Because now you would have college, schools competing against each other, who can provide the best education at the lowest possible cost.
Okay, but what do you do about a homeless family, a kid whose parents or mom is homeless or something like that? There are examples where there would be innocent children, right, 6 years old, ready to go to kindergarten, who has no money for education.
There's always going to be schools will give out scholarships. I mean, there's private charities. I mean, it's not that the government has a monopoly on charity.
So again, he's shifting the goalposts here, right? Oh, well, who's going to provide education to the poor? Charity. Charity is not the free market. You are making an argument on behalf of the free market against government intervention. This would be just as ridiculous as saying, what do you mean? In Cambodia, they had great education provided to them in refugee camps by the United Nations. Yeah, the United Nations isn't government. It's an international coalition of governments. What do you want? This is a non-argument. This is a self-defeating argument. But let's just think through a few further steps here. You say charity. What is that going to be? A charity of secular intellectuals? What if it's a Muslim charity? What if it's a charity from Iran? What if it's a charity from Saudi Arabia? What if it's a charity coming into the ghettos of the United States of America or into small towns to reach out to the poor and hopeless there and saying, hey, you want a chance to become a dentist or a doctor or a nurse? You have to convert to our faith and come to our school, learn by our textbooks and play by our rules. What then? The question isn't just who provides education, who provides universal education. It's a tremendous struggle to allow the charity section to participate in providing education at all, because the government has to intervene constantly to force the Catholic schools and the Mormon schools and the Jewish Orthodox schools to all play by the same rules, to all teach the same curriculum, to teach things like how to use a condom and the theory of evolution and the geological history that the world wasn't created in 7 days, all kinds of things that they don't want to teach and that also the students may not want to learn. All right? One of the most fundamental delusions about free market mechanisms is that they can still work when you're talking about a product that nobody wants to buy. Right? A large part of education is authoritarian, is coercive, is forcing people to learn things that they don't perceive it as being in their best interest to learn. That's why free market mechanisms can never be the solution to this riddle. The same way people don't want to pay a whole lot of money out of their own pocket just to handle, say, sewage treatment. As long as the sewage is somewhere downriver, it's not affecting their own life personally, they don't want to adopt and take responsibility to take on that cost. Even that, though, it's really not quite the same thing as asking, say, the Nazis in Germany right after World War II to teach their own children about the terrible atrocities they themselves committed. What do you think would have happened when the rubble was still on the ground after World War II if you allowed the next generation of Germans to just be educated by the free market? If you just allowed parents to employ whatever tutors they wanted to, if you allowed people to just pay for whatever lesson they wanted, do you think a whole bunch of recently returned war criminals would have paid to establish the universal system of education that has basically created German democracy as we now know it in the 21st century, that they would have paid for their children to receive morality lectures about what terrible people their own parents and grandparents are? In many ways, both subtle and coarse, government-created, government-enforced universal education is constantly teaching us what terrible people our own parents and our own grandparents were.
Let's talk about student loans,
Okay.
right? Because right now, one of the big political issues, especially among the left, right? They want to forgive the student loans and they want to make college free, right? That's
Right.
like a big thing. Like we have all these students with all this debt and it's bad, which I agree. It's a terrible situation. But what the left doesn't want to accept is responsibility for creating the situation in the first place. It is government's fault that all these student loans exist. Without government, there would be no student loans. You know, once upon a time, people didn't borrow money to go to college. Nobody borrowed money to go to college. You know, around the 1960s, once the 18-year-olds could vote, here's what the politicians said to all the 18-year-olds, the Democratic politicians. They said, you know, you shouldn't have to work your summers. You shouldn't have to have jobs while you're in school. You should just be able to go to school and enjoy yourself. And we're going to make it possible for you to borrow money to go to school by guaranteeing the loans. Because normally the bank wouldn't lend you any money because you have no credit history, you have no assets, so you're not going to be able to get a loan. Once the colleges saw that all these kids can borrow money to go to college, well, they were like, this is great. I'm just going to raise prices. So all of a sudden, tuition started to go up. I mean, for a long time, you can look back in the future in history, college tuition used to be pretty stable. It didn't go up very much until the 60s, until the government really got involved. And so as soon as these colleges saw that the kids had access to all this money, they started jacking up prices. I mean, any business that could charge whatever the hell they wanted because the government could borrow the money, right? If you had a restaurant where the government was going to guarantee to pay the bill of everybody who dined there, I mean, shit, the restaurant could charge whatever it wanted. Oh, a hamburger is $1,000. Oh, the government's going to pay? Yeah, what do you care? You know, it's because people are paying with their own money that they got to keep the cost down.
So if this theory were true, it would be equally true in the United States of America and Japan. It would be equally true in the United States of America and Germany. Was the United States of America the only country in the last 70 years to have an increasing role for the government in funding university education? No. Is the contrast between the United States of America and Germany, or the United States of America and Sweden, Denmark, England, Taiwan, each an interesting and instructive case study? Is the contrast between the United States of America and these other countries that those other countries had an unfettered free market of education that avoided bankrupting the students, that avoided creating this student loan crisis, and that only the United States of America made this terrible decision that he's describing to start allowing banks to give loans, to have the government involved in guaranteeing and encouraging bank loans to students they go and get? Very simple empirical methods, very simple comparative analysis is going to show you quickly that the contrast between the United States of America and the countries of Western Europe generally is not a contrast between government intervention and the absence of government intervention. It's a contrast between really bad government policies and somewhat better government policies. But this man's perspective on the world absolutely cannot countenance, cannot be based on, cannot respond to empirical facts. He lives a life of a man of pure faith. It's a religious attitude that he's adopted. He must close his eyes to the facts and continue to believe only in this abstract principle.
Dun, 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 dun.